joining me now, my friend Andy McCarthy, who is he's a best-selling author of many books, including Ball of Collusion, former chief assistant U.S. attorney. Andy, always good to see you. It's like drinking from a fire hose today, actually this entire
Oh
week.
boy.
It's, I mean, what we know so far is that it looks like may the best lawyer win. It looks like it's going to be the Hunger Games with attorneys almost at this point, correct?
Well, I was a lawyer for a long time. I'm getting over it. Hoping, hoping, hopefully by next week. But usually it's not the best lawyer. It's the case that wins.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nice to have a good lawyer, but I'd rather have the facts on my side.
Yes.
On the other hand, in a close election, I'd rather be ahead than behind. So
yes, that's a great point. That's a very great point. The question of voter fraud, it seems that whenever the left loses, there's always the accusation that there's voter fraud. That's why it wasn't because, like with Stacey Abrams in Georgia, it wasn't because Georgians voted against her. They didn't support her. It was because it had to have been stolen. And even when Trump won in 2016, we had these same individuals saying that, well, it was because of a conspiracy theory. And that alone almost makes me, even when I see fraud, I almost stop myself in saying, well, it might be systemic, but not entirely representative of the entire voting system. Are we still at that place in terms of how much voter fraud there really is, and whether or not it could actually change the outcome of a presidential election? Because we have a lot of safeguards in place. That's a lot of people in on it, but I go back and forth, Andy.
Well, I think the last part, you really hit the nail on the head, because what it always comes down to is, would it have made a difference or not? And I'd say it really always comes down to that, because there's always some kind of funky incident or another, or even a whole bunch of them. I was mentioning before, talking about this with someone else, that I've read about 1,000 appellate decisions that in the courts that all say at the beginning, a defendant is entitled to a fair trial, not a perfect trial, because there are no perfect trials.
Right.
And I think you could say the same thing about elections. I like to compare it to a trial, because a trial is very hyper regulated. There's rules of evidence and rules of procedure and all sorts of judge presiding over every second of it. And yet stuff happens and mistakes get made. And what always happens in these cases is, the question is, were so many mistakes made, and were they serious, and did they not get repaired well enough that the whole process at a certain point reaches a critical mass where we have to say, this is not legitimate? And I think elections are the same way. You can always find, especially with the national election, we got 200 million people voting probably by the end of this. You're going to find incidents of fraud. You're going to find incidents of impropriety. In Pennsylvania, there's a big legal issue about
Yes.
whether certain ballots should count or not. Not fraud, but whether the state court of Pennsylvania unconstitutionally overrode what the state legislature said the rules for the election should be. So you have all these things. And the question always at the end is, how serious is it? And the only way you can gauge that is, would it have made a difference? And if it wouldn't have made a difference, this will all be very interesting for a few days, but it'll end up being much ado about nothing. If it would have made a difference, then we're going to be in court for a while.
Yeah, then that's the big question. You bring up Pennsylvania. We're speaking with Andy McCarthy, author of Ball of Collusion, and he's at National Review, and you can see him on Fox News as well. In Pennsylvania, and you bring up a good point, because that is what they had determined, at least going into this election. And I know that there were a lot of fights across the country between Democrats in certain states over mail-in voting and changing the rules so as to accommodate the pandemic. And in Pennsylvania, that is the way that's the regulation. That was the way that the law was. But at the same time, I understand the criticisms from voters, Andy, who say, well, how do you verify a ballot without a postmark? And can you assure people that it was cast during the legal voting period?
This is a great point, because it goes to what we were just talking about. You have to sort of separate, or I put them in two different boxes. There's the first one is the potential for fraud and the actual incidence of fraud.
Right.
And then in the second level of analysis is incidence of fraud and would have made a difference, right? So The big problem with Pennsylvania, there's a sort of a macro problem in that the Constitution requires that state legislatures, not courts, not federal courts, state courts, advisory bodies, bureaucracies, state legislatures make the rules for elections. And what has happened in Pennsylvania is the state court in Pennsylvania, which is Democrat controlled, uh, basically countermanded what the statute says and put in this requirement not only that they keep counting for 3 days after election day. In other words, the ballots can continue to come in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what they say is they're supposed to be submitted on or before election day. So we're only counting things that, happened by 8 p.m. on November 3rd. But then they craft this judicial presumption that says if a ballot is either not postmarked at all or it has an illegible postmark, we're going to deem it, we're going to presume that it was submitted on or before election day. So now that obviously, to go to your point, opens up a big possibility of fraud. You could get, now on November 3rd, because they've started to issue the returns, I know what target I have to hit if I want to commit fraud and swing the results of the election, right? Because I now know what the number is. And then over the next 3 days, you could plow in enough unpostmarked ballots to surpass what the number was on November 3rd. So you can see an easy potential for fraud. But the fact that there's potential fraud doesn't mean it actually gets committed, right?
Right.
And even if there is any, it doesn't necessarily mean it makes a difference. So while we've been all whipped up about this, and I've been whipped up about it from the beginning because I thought the Supreme Court should have jumped in. They should have jumped in 3 weeks ago and resolved this. But the thing is, I was on TV yesterday, Dana, after a guy from Luzerne County in northeastern Pennsylvania, which is one of the biggest counties in the state, 350,000 people, I think. He said the first day, you know how many votes came in? 200. And they were expecting the next day it was going to be maybe 100, maybe 50, and the next day maybe none at all. So you have a situation where you can see a big potential for fraud, and maybe there's some, funky stuff happening. But at the end, if it's only a trickle and it turns out that somebody won by, say, 30,000, what difference does it make? And I have a feeling that what the Supreme Court, which doesn't want to get near this case, right? They absolutely want no part of it. But I think what they may be doing is sitting back and saying, well, how many of these ballots were there really? Because if there weren't that many, why should we get involved in this thing?
Yeah, that's a great point as well. One of the things that Pam Bondi and others have brought up, we're talking with Andy McCarthy, is the presence of poll watchers, which we have them in Texas. We had them in my home state of Missouri. I know that it's kind of customary and legally protected, really. What was the big, why is it, and correct me if I have this wrong, in Pennsylvania, Democrats were trying to appeal to prevent Republican poll watchers from actually being there at these centers where the votes are being counted?
Yeah, there's disturbing stories about this all over the country. Pennsylvania, I think more than other places. And the issue was, how close do you let them get to observe so that they can do what they are there to do, which is to monitor whether the people who are doing the counting appear to be doing their job legitimately. What the courts say is they're not there to audit, right? It's the counters aren't there to say, okay, the next ballot is for Biden. Here's the Biden ballot, and put it in the pile. There's certain ways that you would cheat. You'd either mark up the ballot or you'd slide it into the machine the wrong way or whatever you do. So the people who are watching know what they're watching for. And the question is, how close do they need to be to make that process legitimate? So in most places, they were kept 6 feet away. I talked to somebody yesterday who was involved in the process in Michigan, and they said that for all of the hysterical reporting, what went on in Michigan, as far as the count was concerned, was completely fine. It was legitimate. There was no problem with it. There was a lot of noise outside the room, but that was mostly people who are not involved in the count. But both parties were inside the room. They're involved in the count. They're watching. It's fine. But they were allowed to get within 6 feet and watch. So what happened in Pennsylvania apparently is they kept them 25 feet away. So they're hysterical now that it's 25 feet instead of 6 feet. And what I point out to people is that could be a problem. But on the other hand, and if people who are baseball fans, I think will understand this, right? Even in a night game in baseball, the pitcher is 60 feet, 6 inches from the catcher. And they throw like 99, I feel like they throw 150 miles an hour, but and the catcher puts the glove down, right? And puts one finger for a fastball and 2 fingers for a curveball. And we figure that from 60 feet, 6 inches, the catcher can tell whether it's 1 finger or 2, even during a night game. Because if he couldn't, there'd be, a 99 mile an hour fastball when he was looking for a curveball. That would be a problem. So I just can't get whipped up about 25 feet as long as they're allowed to do what they're there to do, which is observe it in a meaningful way. If they're allowed to do that, it doesn't seem to me to be a big deal that it's 25 feet, but I'm not in the process.
Yeah. The last question for you, we're talking with our friend Andy McCarthy. How does this end up? And I think a lot of people and myself are kind of wondering, is this also maybe turning into more than just Trump? I almost feel like it is kind of in some ways an attack on not just the integrity of our voting system, but our perception of that integrity. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And it's a real sad part of it if you think about where how divided we are as a society. And that really stops from the top down, beginning with the media and the political class. I was taken aback about a month ago. I happened to catch, I don't know why, on YouTube, the Kennedy-Nixon debate, the first one from 1960. And it's an amazing thing to watch from our period of time, where you have these two guys who not only are very fluent on policy, but they were utterly respectful to each other. And every time a question got asked, each one of them was trying to narrow the differences. And they'd start out by saying, we both agree on, X, Y, or Z basic thing. Now let's get down to the thing we're wrong about. And they conceded each other's love of the country and patriotism and wanting the country to do better. And it became an argument over what the argument was about, which was policy.
Right.
Flash forward to where we are now. Nobody attributes or presumes anybody's good faith. And everybody's on a hair trigger. The minute something happens, it's like you go to 11. And it's not healthy, and to have these guys out there at the heads of the campaign and in the political class and in a lot of the media commentariat, and the first time something happens, it's like completely hysterical and the process is awful and they're trying to steal it and it's all for, it might be, but let's not go to 11 until we have to,
Right.
In every single election, there are incidents of fraud. And if this is a very close election, it sure looks like it is, they're going to get their day in court and they'll be able to prove that the fraud may have made a difference in the outcome. I assume that if President Trump didn't think that the court system was a place where he could get redress, he wouldn't bother to file lawsuits.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We have a system, we have checks and balances. Let's just let it work.
There we go. Andy McCarthy, always appreciate your expertise on these issues. I know you've been pulling double duty. I've seen you everywhere, and we appreciate your time with us today. Thank you, my friend.
Thanks, Dana. Beats having a job.
That is your job. America's lawyer.